If you had told me 5 years ago that I would willingly make the drive back to our old lake house in Michigan, I probably would have laughed and told you that was impossible. In my mind, Lake Orion had always been a place I escaped from, not a place I'd choose to return. But life is rarely as simple as the lines we draw for ourselves. Here I was, a single mother, guiding my silver Honda along those winding roads surrounded by the dense, familiar trees. My daughter, Ellie, slept in the back seat, her favorite stuffed rabbit cradled in her arms. She was 8 years old and impossibly gentle, with the same big blue eyes I remembered seeing in the bathroom mirror when I was a child. I had spent the last several years in Boston, building a new life, new friends, a new job, a new sense of myself, but the lake kept tugging at me, like an old song I could not forget. Maybe I was driven by nostalgia, or maybe I was simply hoping to prove to myself that I was not the same frightened girl who left so long ago. Ellie had never seen the place where I grew up. She had only heard my stories, half shrouded in nostalgia and caution, about summers at the water's edge and winters, with snow piled high against the windows. In her mind, the lake house was a kind of magical cottage, painted by my selective memory. In reality, it was a 2-story white house with blue shutters, its paint peeling in places, and a porch with boards that creaked under your weight. Out back, a tire swing dangled from the same old maple tree that shaded the yard when I was a child. The place was still in my father's name, although everyone in the family seemed to claim some part of it, whether in dollars or memories. It was the kind of house that felt crowded even when it was empty, its walls echoing with every argument and every laugh that had ever passed through them. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, the house came into view, half hidden behind tall wildflowers and weeds that nobody bothered to cut anymore. I parked and sat there for a moment, my hands trembling just a little on the steering wheel. Ellie stirred in the back seat, waking up as if she could sense my nerves. I forced a smile and told her we were finally here. She grinned, eager to explore, and bounded out of the car, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. I followed her, feeling my heart pound in my chest as I walked up the porch steps that once seemed so much taller. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother appeared, dressed in her usual soft pastel sweater and slacks, her silver hair pulled back tight. She smiled in a way that made her wrinkles deepen. But there was a tension there I recognized instantly, a stiffness in her shoulders. My father was not far behind, moving slowly, his beard grayer and his eyes more tired than I remembered. They greeted Ellie and me like we were visitors at a beat, trying so hard to keep up appearances that it almost hurt to watch. The old house smelled the same as a Weza, strange mix of pine needles, lemon cleaner, and lake water. My brother David had already arrived from New York with his wife, Lucy. He greeted me with a quick, almost formal hug, and Lucy tried her best to make small talk, asking about my drive and Ellie's school. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind you get from too many family gatherings. David was the golden child, always in control, always with something to prove. He'd done well for himself in finance, talking about dollars like they were points in a game he was born to win. Our childhood rivalry felt both ancient and immediate, simmering just beneath the surface, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room. Despite the tension, I tried to keep my guard up and my expectations low. I wanted Ellie to experience the good. I remembered the scent of pine trees in the morning, the lake glimmering under a pink sunset, the way the house seemed to hum with life when everyone was gathered in the living room. I even hoped she'd fall in love with the old upright piano in the hallway, which had gone out of tune years ago, but still managed to play the melody of Greensleeves if you knew just how to coax it. After all, it wasn't all bad. There were memories of laughter by the fire, of Seymour's roasted under the stars, of my grandmother's stories about her years in Europe before she came to America. That first afternoon, I tried to keep things light. We walked down to the dock, Ellie running ahead, laughing as she chased the dragonflies. She dipped her toes in the water and asked if it was true that I once fell through the ice one winter. I laughed, surprised at the relief in my voice, and told her about the time David and I had to be rescued by our uncle after venturing too far out during a February thaw. I wanted her to see the lake as a place of wonder, not of pain. Dinner that evening was a careful affair. My mother cooked her famous pot roast, and my father poured wine that tasted just slightly off. Conversation drifted from Safe Tapacelli's school, David's latest investment, Lucy's work as a graphic designer. It all felt a little forced, as though we were actors in a play we'd each performed 100 times. Ellie stayed quiet, sensing the undercurrents, but eventually relaxed enough to share her drawings with Lucy, who praised each one as if they belonged in a museum. Later that night, while Ellie played quietly in her room, I lay awake on the lumpy guest mattress, listening to the muffled laughter coming from the kitchen below. My parents and David were reminiscing about something from years ago, their voices growing louder as the evening wore on. Every so often, I caught snippets of conversation that made my stomach tighten, a joke at my expense, a half-remembered story twisted into something funny. I braced myself, knowing that beneath the laughter, the old family patterns were waiting, as sharp and familiar as ever. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remind myself that I was not that frightened girl anymore. I was here for Ellie, for myself, to see if I could make peace with the past, or at least learn how to live with it. I drifted off to sleep, the sound of Ellie's soft breathing down the hall, reminding me why I had come back. For her, I told myself. For both of us, if there was any way left to reclaim something good from this old house and the memories it held. The next morning dawned soft and gray, the sky over Lake Orion blurred with early clouds. I was still half asleep when I heard the clatter of pans in the kitchen. My mother's idea of hospitality was to wake the house with the sounds and smells of breakfast. As if bacon and coffee could plaster over the cracks in our family, I made myself get up, washed my face, and went to check on Ellie. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the quilt, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, humming quietly to herself. I ruffled her hair and told her breakfast was ready. Downstairs, the kitchen was already crowded. My father had commandeered the syrup, pouring it over his pancakes with the enthusiasm of a man who had never heard of blood sugar. My mother moved briskly between the stove and the table, snapping at Lucy to pour juice and making sure everyone's plate was full. David sat at the head of the table, tapping his phone and pretending to be busy. Ellie slid into the chair beside me, her eyes wide and hopeful, taking in the scene as if it were a movie she'd never seen before. For a while, everything seemed almost normal, as if we could fake our way through a morning together. The table was set with chipped plates I remembered from childhood, the ones with faded blue cornflowers around the edges. My mother pushed food onto everyone's plates and fussed over the temperature of the coffee, while my father cracked jokes that no one laughed at but himself. David was restless, issuing orders about how the pancakes should be stacked, how the butter should be passed. It was like he couldn't stand not being in charge of something, even something as small as breakfast. Ellie, still lost in her world of music and drawings, started humming softly while she cut her pancakes. It was her favorite song from school, and I recognized the gentle lilt, the little lift in her voice when she reached the chorus. She didn't realize, or didn't remember, that noise had always set David off. Even as a child, he hated anything he couldn't control. He'd shout over the television, snap at me for giggling too loud, and glare at anyone who interrupted his reading. In the city, he could disappear into the noise, but here at the lake house, every sound seemed too great on him. He glared at Ellie. "Ellie, can you be quiet?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the room, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too wrapped up in her song, her fork dancing across her plate. My stomach tightened. I wanted to reach over to hush her gently, but before I could, David's hand shot out, quick and brutal. He slapped her across the face so hard the sound echoed off the walls. Ellie's fork clattered to the floor, and for a split second, the room fell into a perfect, horrified silence. My mother was the first to speak, and what she said made my blood run cold. She laughed a brittle, high-pitched sound and said, "David always had a firm hand. It's how you keep kids in line." My father just shrugged, not even looking at Ellie, and muttered something about discipline. Lucy, who'd always seemed nervous around my family, stared at David as if she'd never seen him before. But no one moved to comfort my daughter, whose face was already flushing a deep, angry red where David's palm had landed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My world tilted and shrank until all I could see was Ellie, her trembling chin, the tears welling in her eyes, the shock and betrayal written across her face. My body moved before my brain caught up. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the tile, reached for her, and pulled her into my lap, rocking her gently. My hands shook with fury and heartbreak. "It's okay, baby. You're safe with me," I whispered, even though I knew, at that moment, I couldn't promise her safety anywhere in this house. David just scoffed, wiping his hand on a napkin like it was nothing. My mother fussed with the plates, pretending nothing had happened, and my father buried his head in the newspaper. I could see Lucy out of the corner of my eye, her mouth opening and closing, wanting to say something but terrified to break the unspoken rules of the family. The air felt thick and sour, like a storm about to break. But what no one realized, what they had never bothered to ask, was that I had brought my camera. David, years before, had insisted that we document every family gathering for the family legacy, and the habit stuck. The little video camera sat quietly on a shelf in the corner, blinking red. It had recorded every word, every gesture, the ugly sound of his hand meeting my daughter's face, the laughter, the indifference. That legacy would finally serve a different purpose. I tried to steady myself, heart pounding. As I looked around the room, I saw my family as if for the first time. My mother's hard mouth, my father's weak hands, David's cruel self-importance, Lucy's stunned silence. I knew then that I couldn't stay, not even for a weekend, not even to try to prove to myself that I was different now. Without a word, I stood up, still holding Ellie. My mother called after me, voice tight with annoyance. "Where are you going? Breakfast isn't finished." I ignored her. I carried Ellie upstairs, shushing her gently as she sobbed into my shoulder. I packed our bags with shaking hands, grabbing Ellie's clothes, her rabbit, and my things. I slipped the memory card out of the camera and tucked it into my wallet, my hands moving on autopilot. In my mind, that memory card might as well have been worth $1 million. It was proof undeniable, unspinnable of what happened in this house. Lucy caught me in the hallway, her face stricken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know," she whispered, voice trembling. I told her it wasn't her fault, that it never was. She nodded and stepped aside, eyes wet, her hand shaking as she squeezed my arm. I wished I could say something to comfort her, but the words wouldn't come. I walked Ellie down the stairs, past my parents' icy stairs, out the front door, and into the pale morning light. The air outside was cold and bright. Ellie clung to me, her face buried in my coat. I buckled her into the car and kissed her forehead. "We're leaving," I told her. "And I promise, you'll never have to see that again." She nodded, too tired to speak, her eyes big and scared. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the house that had haunted me for so long. I didn't look back. As I drove, my mind raced. I didn't know what would happen next, or where exactly we would go, but I knew I was done pretending, done letting my family's violence and silence shape who I was or what my daughter would become. With every mile between us and the lake house, I felt something old and poisonous loosen its grip on me. I didn't know if I was brave, but I knew I was done being silent. I pressed my hand to my pocket, feeling the sharp edge of the memory card through the fabric. It was small, but it was everything. Proof that we were not crazy. That's what happened. Ellie fell asleep before we even reached the highway, her breath coming slow and deep. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her cheeks still pink but her face peaceful. In that moment, I made a promise to myself, to her, to whatever future we might find. We would not be quiet. Not anymore. If anyone had told me that freedom would feel as much like confusion as relief, I don't know if I would have believed them. Driving away from Lake Orion, the landscape of Michigan rolling by in blurred green and gold, I kept glancing at Ellie in the rearview mirror. Her sleep was restless, her hands curled into fists even as she dreamed. My thoughts wouldn't settle, spiraling between fury, grief, and the cold necessity of what needed to happen next. I wanted to keep driving forever, but eventually I set my course for Ann Arbor, where my best friend Natalie had always promised me refuge. I'd never actually taken her up on it, but this time, I needed to. I called her on the drive and didn't bother hiding the fear in my voice. She just said, "Come as soon as you can, everything else can wait." Natalie's house in Ann Arbor was the opposite of my childhood home. Her front yard was a wild patchwork of herbs and flowers, a blue ceramic gnome peeking out from beneath a tangle of sage. Inside, every wall was lined with books or covered in art, and her kitchen smelled perpetually of fresh coffee. Mia, her partner, was finishing a night shift at the hospital when we arrived. But Natalie made up the guest bed, set out a basket of snacks and toiletries, and wrapped Ellie in a warm hug. Before I could even explain, "You're safe here," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering, and I believed her. For the first time since leaving the lake house, I let myself cry. While Ellie watched cartoons and cradled her rabbit, I told Natalie the whole story. I didn't spare her, the details, the slap, my parents' laughter, the old patterns that kept us all trapped. Natalie listened, eyes shining with tears and anger, but she didn't interrupt or rush me. When I finally finished, she asked, "Do you have anything that could help prove what happened?" I nodded and pulled the memory card from my wallet, holding it as if it were a precious stone. David wanted everything documented for the family legacy. Now, I think it's going to do the opposite. Mia came home a little before noon, still in her scrubs and smelling faintly of antiseptic. She took one look at Ellie's face and insisted we go to the hospital to get her checked. The pediatrician was kind and thorough, documenting the bruise and quietly asking Ellie questions about how she felt. I watched Ellie cling to her rabbit, bravely answering each question. The doctor typed up a full report and gave me a copy, then offered referrals for therapy. Mia squeezed my shoulder and told me we'd done the right thing. And suddenly I felt less alone, like I was part of something bigger than my family's secrecy. The next days blurred into a string of appointments, phone calls, and quiet moments trying to reassure Ellie that the worst was over. I reached out to her new school counselor, explaining as much as I could without breaking down. The counselor listened, took notes, and promised to keep an eye on Ellie, to be a safe adult she could turn to at school. Natalie helped me find a family attorney who specialized in cases like ours. We met in her office, dark wood furniture, diplomas on the wall, a vase of bright sunflowers on the desk. She listened carefully, watched the video, and told me she'd help us put together everything we'd need if things escalated. For the first time, someone outside the family saw the truth and didn't flinch. Meanwhile, I started thinking about what would come next. The weight of the memory card in my hand was both terrifying and empowering. I copied the video file, made backups, and stored one on Natalie's cloud drive, just in case. With her help, I drafted a letter to David's workplace in Manhattan, a private investment firm where he sat on the board of a children's charity and routinely boasted about his commitment to family values. I didn't sign my name. I just included the video, the medical report, and a single line. "This is what David Reynolds does to children in his care." I sent copies to the charity's board, to his supervisor, and, after a sleepless night, to a journalist I remembered from Boston, who had covered high-profile family abuse cases. Sending those files felt like jumping off a cliff, but it also felt like taking my life back, one small, irreversible step at a time. The fallout came faster than I could have predicted. Within days, the video was circulating in Manhattan's financial circles. David's boss called him in for a meeting, and the board issued a statement placing him on leave pending an investigation. The charity quietly took down his profile from their website. I heard all this through Lucy, who called me in tears, her voice barely a whisper as she apologized for everything. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I only wish she'd found the strength to speak up sooner, for herself and for any children who might have crossed David's path. That week, the phone calls started. First, it was my father, blustering about how I'd ruined the family name. Then my mother, alternating between tears and anger, insisted that I had blown everything out of proportion. Some relatives demanded to know if it was true. Others accused me of setting David up, of inventing a story to hurt him out of jealousy or spite. But for every accusation, there was a voice of support: cousins who messaged quietly, friends from college who shared their own stories, and my Aunt Grace, calling from London. She told me she'd seen what David was capable of when we were kids, and that she believed me. "If you need money for legal fees, I can send pounds. No questions asked," she said, her voice steady and warm. Her words meant more than I could say. With every message, I felt the family fracture. Some defended David with the same ferocity they'd once reserved for him at family gatherings, circling the wagons. Others asked for the truth, finally willing to listen. In the middle of all this, my grandmother Margaret called from Chicago. She had always been the matriarch, the only one who could make David pause, even if just for a moment. "I've heard the recording," she said over the phone, her voice low but resolute. "I want the whole family here, at my house. No excuses. We're going to deal with this, and I expect the truth from everyone." The relief that washed over me was unexpected and enormous. For so long, I'd felt alone, convinced that no one would ever take my side. Now, at least one person was willing to break the silence, to confront what had been swept under the rug for generations. I agreed to come, knowing that whatever happened at Margaret's house would change the family forever. That night, I watched Ellie sleep, her face peaceful at last, the bruise fading, but the memory lingering. I sat by her bed and promised her and myself that I would see this through. Whatever it cost, we would not go back to silence. We would not protect abusers. We would stand in the light, no matter how hard it was. And in that moment, for the first time since the lake house, I felt something like hope. My hands trembled as I rang the bell at Margaret's brownstone in Chicago. Ellie's small hand folded into mine. The city seemed impossibly big, full of sounds and life that had nothing to do with the mess we brought with us. The street was busy with people heading to work, walking their dogs, living their lives, blissfully unaware of the family earthquake about to rumble behind my grandmother's red door. Ellie looked up at me with worried eyes, and I forced a smile, squeezing her hand. "This is just a meeting," I whispered, though we both knew it was more. Margaret greeted us at the door herself, upright and dignified as ever, her hair pulled back in a neat French twist. She hugged Ellie and me tightly. No small talk, just a fierce press of arms that told me she understood the weight I carried. The living room was already crowded. My parents sat on the edge of the sofa, stiff and silent, my father staring at his shoes, my mother twisting a tissue in her lap. David was there, his jaw clenched, his posture defensive and angry, and Lucy sat beside him, her arms folded tight across her chest. A few aunts and uncles had made the trip from Ohio and Indiana, their faces tight with anticipation, curiosity, or Dorita, I couldn't tell which. Margaret called us all to sit and calm. With her characteristic calm announced, "We are going to talk about what happened at Lake Orion. We are not going to shout, we are going to listen, and we are going to look at the truth." David was the first to speak, his words clipped and "I think this is all being blown out of proportion. It was a misunderstanding, kids make noise, and sometimes people overreact. I'm sure I don't need to be put on trial in front of the whole family." He shot me a look of cold resentment, as if daring me to contradict him. For a moment, I felt the old fear rise in my throat, the urge to shrink and apologize, but then I looked at Ellie, sitting so quietly beside me, and I knew I couldn't back down. Not now, not ever again. "I have the recording," I said, pulling the memory card from my bag. My hands shook as I slotted it into Margaret's laptop and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Ellie's soft singing, the sharp crack of David's slap, and my mother's laughter. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I saw the truth settle over the faces of my relatives, saw denial crack and break in real time. Some closed their eyes, others looked away. But no one could pretend it hadn't happened. Not anymore. Margaret's eyes were blazing as she closed the laptop. "This ends now. No more secrets. No more pretending this family is something it isn't." She turned to David, her voice steady. "You hurt your niece, and instead of being ashamed, you lied. We do not protect abusers in this family. Not anymore." For the first time, I saw my brother look truly uncertain. He glanced at Lucy, but she didn't reach for him. Her eyes were glassy with tears, her shoulders shaking as she finally let herself break down. The conversation that followed was raw and ugly. Some relatives tried to blame me, saying I should never have shared the recording, accusing me of tearing the family apart by airing dirty laundry. My mother, voice quivering, insisted she'd only laughed out of shock, that she'd never wanted anyone to get hurt. My father remained silent, a deep shame etched into the lines of his face. Others, like Aunt Grace who had flown in from London, stood and called for accountability, her British accent sharper than ever as she declared, "There is no healing without truth." Margaret was relentless, guiding the conversation with firmness and compassion. She told my parents that their denial had allowed harm to grow unchecked, that their silence was a form of complicity. She urged the family to stop focusing on reputation and start focusing on repair. It wasn't easy. Angering grief bounced from wall to wall, old resentments surfacing with every accusation and apology. But there was a sense, for the first time, that something was finally shifting, that the old cycles were finally breaking. The days that followed were a blur of fallout and reckoning. David's life unraveled with breathtaking speed. Lucy filed for divorce, quietly packing her things and moving in with her sister in Evanston. David's workplace demoted him, stripping him of his team and his corner office, and the children's charity he'd championed for years erased his name from their board. Friends he'd once counted on in New York stopped answering his calls, and the social invitations dried up overnight. He tried to reach out to me once, a single angry text blaming me for his ruined life, but I blocked his number without hesitation. My parents, prodded by Margaret and, perhaps, by their slowdening regret, agreed to start therapy. I never thought I would see my mother sit in a therapist's office, but there she was, week after week, working to unravel her denial. My father was quieter about it, but over time, he began to call and ask about Ellie. Tentative steps toward repair, small gestures that I chose to meet with cautious hope. Ellie and I moved back to Ann Arbor, settling into a modest rental house with a wide front porch and a tiny backyard full of dandelions. With the help of Natalie and Mia, we built a new rhythm: a morning walk to school, movie nights on the couch, pancakes on Sunday mornings. I found a therapist for both of us, and slowly, the nightmares that haunted Ellie began to fade. Natalie and Mia became our chosen family, showing up with groceries, homemade soup, or simply an open door whenever we needed it. Some relatives, like Aunt Grace, kept in touch, sending cards and emails, checking on us from across the Atlantic. Ellie began to sing again. At first, it was just a whisper, her voice soft and shaky, afraid of taking up space, but with each passing week, her confidence grew. She joined the school choir, surprising both herself and me. I would watch her at rehearsals, her little face bright and alive, and feel a deep, aching pride. There were still hard days, of course, days when the past weighed heavily, when Ellie asked questions I could barely answer, when I missed the idea of a whole, happy family. But there was laughter now, too, and comfort, and something like peace. One evening, as autumn settled over an arbor and the first hints of winter crept in, Ellie and I baked cookies in our kitchen. The radio played softly in the background, and the windows steamed up with the warmth from the oven. Out of nowhere, Ellie started singing, her voice ringing clear and bright, filling the whole room. I stood there, a wooden spoon in hand, and felt tears prick my eyes. She was safe, here with me, in this new home we'd built together. The darkness was still there, but it no longer owned us. I realized, then, that the cycle of harm had stopped with me. The scars would always be part of our story, but they didn't have to define us. With community, honesty, and a kind of hard-won courage, we were making something new, a life with room for singing, for healing, for hope. In the quiet of our kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of our chosen family, I finally let myself believe that we were going to be okay. And as Ellie's song rose through the house, I understood that we had not just survived, we had begun to truly live.